Hey, everybody. Welcome back to The Collective. We have another fantastic show for you planned out today. I am very excited. I apologize for the sheen. I am sweating quite a bit as I was running around right before the show started. I do really appreciate everybody jumping in. If there are any thoughts or comments or questions about anything we talk about, do throw them up in the comment section. While I am going through that whole rigmarole, though, I would like you guys to do your rigmarole. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, do all that great stuff that we get your email every day that we go live, which is, of course, every day. Now, today's topic is going to be grit. And I was originally going to come up with this super cool bunch of synonyms and all kinds of things of like what other words you could call grit in other cultures, but I did not have time today. So we're just going to jump right into the conversation. Any thoughts or issues before we get started?
Well,
Everybody
just
good?
to start us off on a definition, if that's what you're looking for, or synonyms and antonyms and all that good stuff,
Cinnamons.
cinnamon stuff. I did put a little post on my IG before I hopped into this because I wanted to understand the origination of the word grit. And so it comes from the Old English word grit, Grytt, I believe it is. And that is an old schooly reference to large pebbles, large rocks, usually at the side of an ocean on a beachfront. So that's where the Old English word came from. And the belief is that the origination story goes from, like be gritty, be hard, be resilient, be like a rock, as it were. And so that kind of not got watered down, but it got converted into the grit of a beach can represent the grit in your life. Now, that origination story to the word grit, I think the word grit then became the intermediary position to what we're facing now, which is a word that gets tossed around casually like, oh, he's got grit, she's got grit, there's the grit store. And so grit is now not as, I feel, potent a word as it used to be. So I'd like to bring the word grit that's casually tossed around in all the books and magazines, like to bring it back to more of a gritty grit sort of word.
I like that. The image that keeps coming up in my head right now is of how the waves would smash on those rocks and the rocks would never move. So I could see where that imagery would come from. In that those things would be very difficult or very tough. Travis, what's your definition on grit?
I think most of us come at it from like kind of to the physical and the mental aspects of it, right? I think of grit as the ability to persevere, through either a physical or a mental challenge. It might be something that's very difficult, a race, running a foot race, and you gotta keep driving on to get to the finish line. And it might be, you're working through some kind of gross mental challenge, trying to develop new courses of action or something like that. And you still have to have grit in order to make it to the desired outcome. So it comes to us in many different ways. I think we agree that it's more of a mental condition than it would be a physical condition. I think you can develop your grit through physical challenge. Kind of in a lot of the things I think we've discussed is, the challenge of it is where the human kind of excels, and the desire to persevere. I also think that you have to also be smart about it. Just because you have that positive mental picture of what's going to happen doesn't necessarily mean that is what's going to happen. So you have to know your limits, and you have to weigh the cost to benefit. If you injure yourself in a race to get to that finish line first, are you going to be able to race again? Is it something you don't care about? Is it worth it to you to injure yourself in order to win? And you have to weigh those things, and it's hard not to tie all the things that we talk about into one thing. You start off on grit, and then you get into, that's our mental toughness, and then you get into your emotional well-being, and it just snowballs, and now you're just talking, it's like a whole encompassing thing of being better humans.
That's why we're
Agreed.
spending the whole week on peak performance.
Yeah.
And every one of these so far, I broke these down into 7 things, and then every single one of them has turned into this topic is so large we could do a whole week on just this one topic, and so it's
Yeah.
been interesting.
I mean,
sure.
initially when you told me peak performance, I think about even peak performance in kind of two different ways. You know, are you trying to win the race? Are you trying to lift the most weight, or are you trying to perform in an unknown environment? You know, like you kind of come at those things in a different way. You know, how are you recording your capability right now, and how are you developing that to like perform better the next time? You know, it's different if you're training for an Ironman that you know is on this date versus if you're an operator and you have no idea when your beeper is going to go off and you have to perform at your best every day of the week of the year, you know. So those two things are different as well when it comes to peak performance, like all encompassing.
Absolutely. One of the interesting things you said there that just clicked in my head is that, you know, you could run a triathlon on a certain date, but as an operator, you might just have to run a triathlon
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Tomorrow. Yeah.
A second ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, you're
Jake,
already behind.
exactly. Jake, what's your thoughts on grit?
Well, I think a great word that Travis used was perseverance. So I think grit is having the passion and drive to persevere. It's not just the perseverance itself. It's having the ability and drive to do that. And the other word that you used, I think that I hear a lot, is resilience. Those are two definitely like comparable words, but I think resilience is the ability to recover from some sort of misfortune, where grit is the ability to stay on a difficult task for an extended period of time. So I think that's the difference in that. And I think that grit it's not really like a trait. It's something that could be developed through a tremendous amount of effort. And I think that takes sometimes years of practice to do so. But I definitely think that there's a little bit of a difference there. But I think it's passion to persevere is a good way to say it.
That's okay, Chance, you're muted. I can take it. So I like those two words combined, and that's how I was thinking of grit, is passion and perseverance. You can persevere through all kinds of things until you don't have to, or you don't feel like you want to anymore. And so, thinking of what we were just talking about, a running race. So if you've set a running race for yourself, and as you're running towards the finish line, you've got to dig deep, we'll call it, and you've got to have some perseverance, we'll call it. But if you don't have the right amount of passion, you might not be able to run beyond that finish line. And that's the thing about, we'll call it tier 1, for lack of a better term. We'll call it like hard selections, for lack of a better term. You don't know where the finish line is. In fact, the finish line that you just crossed just became the start line again. And so as you're running towards your finish line, you'll see that finish line and you'll think, I just got to make it to the finish line. I'm barely hanging on. I think I've got the perseverance. And when you get just across, a staffer or a directing staff will look at you and say, that ain't the finish line. Keep going. The finish line's on the other side of the horizon. And it's that mental moment where you get to realize the difference between resilience and grit. Grit, you've got to have the passion to persevere. You've got to want it bad enough to go do the bad things. You've got to, it's got to be really, I'm not sure if even passion is the right word. It's got to be a love for the game that you're in. And the game isn't like tiddlywinks, but it's still a game that you're engaging in. And that game is called freaking doing your best for the right reasons in that moment. And for me, where I've learned the most grittiness is when I'm having to perform beyond my expected abilities on behalf of another, the unit that's wrapped around me, the organization that's wrapped around me, the small team that I'm responsible to or for. My grit always came from being responsible to a higher calling rather than just me bumbling around in the world trying to create grit all by myself. So I think that grit is a combination of passion and perseverance, and the passion part is the more critical part than the perseverance part.
Yeah, totally agree. And one of the interesting parts about, come on, there we go. One of the interesting parts about all this is we now have Larry has joined us. Fantastic. Good to see you, Larry.
Right.
Hello, Larry.
Let me get him unmuted here. There we go. So, quick little intro. It's going to throw us off a little bit, but Larry, if you wouldn't mind giving us a quick 30-second, 45-second, who you are, where you come from, all that good stuff, and then we'll get into your thoughts on grit. What do you think?
Yeah. Sorry for the delay. My computer is gone down the tube, so gritting it through that and just jumped on the phone to make it happen. So sorry if I've got feedback and everything else. I went through the whole thing of working computer.
Sounding pretty good right now.
Getting that all good. So sorry. Larry Sutherland, former Army, did started in communications, went psychological operations. After that, married, divorced, done all of those things. Got into jiu-jitsu with my son. Figured as he was getting older, it was going to be a great thing for us to do together. Now I'm first degree black belt under Mark Redding in Texas, Jared Weiner, part of the TAC team organization that's on a worldwide level.
Outstanding. So what we've all kind of defined our version of what we think grit is. Why don't you give us your definition of what grit is?
My definition of grit would be the thing that you have to go through to really get to the goals that you're trying to do. I don't think that you can achieve what you consider or what your definition is of greatness in your life without going through grit. If you don't have to go through grit to get it, it's not really the purpose of what you're chasing.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. And then to Sean's point, as you were coming in here, I just want to retouch on it, Sean, if you wouldn't mind. Could you give us the Coles notes so Larry can pick up what you were just saying?
Sorry.
Cole's notes on which aspect, Chance?
Just the last sequence right before he came in.
Okay, so basically what I was doing is discussing my consideration of what grit is to me, and that is the combination of passion and perseverance, and that you can persevere in the moment, and that's all good. We've all, I think everyone on the panel has persevered through a number of things, but perseverance, I feel, only gets you a portion of grittiness. It's the passion that will drive the perseverance. I think you've got to be really passionate about what you do to take you over the finish line, and then look at the horizon and keep on running towards that next finish line. So you got to be passionate about whatever you're into. And you'd mentioned starting BJJ with your son. I see the We Defy Foundation t-shirt. Freaking awesome. I started BJJ with both of my boys 8 years ago. My oldest son is my favorite rolling partner. He's been with me on the mats now for 8 years. And maybe one day he'll be a black belt and I'll still be a purple belt. And that'll make me extremely happy. And so I think that your story and kind of my story in respect to just BJJ, as it were, in order to kind of move through the years of BJJ, you've got to have perseverance and you've got to have passion. Because wanting to learn a martial art is one thing, but wanting to learn BJJ is an entirely different thing, because there's an amount of grittiness required within BJJ because of all of the things that it brings to the table. So I feel that anyone who's achieved a black belt in BJJ is a fine example of someone who understands grit.
You got any points on that, Larry?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You know, I kind of am known for a hashtag of know your why. And I don't care whatever your passion is, whether it's, you know, going through what you're going to have to go through, depending on what your military background is, or jiu-jitsu is a great example of it, because the mats don't lie. You can have a great training session, and then the next time you come in, go with those same people. And for whatever changes have happened during that day, whether it's your mental focus, whether it's what you ate the day before, whether it's the rest you got, can totally be different the next day. And you have to know what your why is.
Yeah, absolutely. Sean says that all the time.
I do.
Travis?
I agree.
Yeah. What do
I
you
think there was one thing that.
Agree.
Oh, Jake, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Travis.
Hey, I'm the moderator here.
I know.
You go ahead. Hit me, Jake. What do you got?
I was just going to say there was something Sean was alluding to a little bit, but I didn't think he touched directly on it, was that he was starting to move to the fact that it was when he was relying on a greater power than himself. And I think that that's why we see grit and digging, like kind of digging deep, is in a lot of team sports, because you're so reliant on everyone else that's part of your crew or team. So I think that that was something you're kind of alluding to, Sean, but didn't address directly. But I think that term, like digging deep, is definitely like kind of your demonstration of grit.
Interesting.
And you know,
Travis?
like digging
Oh,
deep,
yeah.
that kind of goes back to a classic case of the grit word comes from the Old English word grit, which is referring to pebbles and rocks on the beach. And so we've all been kids. We've all built those sandcastles. We've all dug down into the sand. But at what point did we stop digging? If someone would have told me when I was a kid, if you keep digging, Sean, you can reach Australia, I'd still be on that beach digging, because someone has given me a goal that I'm academically curious about, or I have some adventurous spirit on. And so I'm going to dig into it. And I'm only going to stop when I lose the passion for the task that I've put in front of myself. So if I dig halfway to Australia and I lose my passion to dig, well, I'll stop. But if I've got the passion, I'll keep digging all the way through the Earth's core. And I think that's one of the aspects of grit is we can talk about perseverance and passion, and the loose word passion can be underwhelming unless you are considering it as my passion. When I apply passion to something that requires perseverance, I freaking give it 100%. My passion is not 12%. My passion is not 17%. My passion is maximum effort. Because if I'm engaging in something that I feel is important, it's going to get my all. And I think that that's an important aspect of grit. In order to start developing grit, you've got to pour yourself into something that is hard to start better understanding how important that thing is to you, but more importantly, start understanding how important your passion is to the moment.
That's a great point. Travis, now I'm going to come to you. What do you think?
I like the word passion a lot. That it kind of ties right into desire, passion and desire. You know, if you're passionate about something and you really want it, you know, you desire that outcome, whatever. It ties right into grit. And I think maybe the reason that we are even on this topic of what is grit and why is it important is, like, you know, through all the selections and things, you know, you show up to selection on day one and there's 1,000 people standing in the line, and then on the last day there's not, right? So like, what separates all those people who had, you know, the want, but they didn't meet the outcome? And that's grit, you know, the actual passion for what the outcome is, and the desire to make it all the way to the end and achieve what you set out to achieve. You know, grit is the determining factor between the best and the good, the okay, the you know, the acceptable. You know, I don't want acceptable, I want optimal, I want the best, I want, and in order to achieve that, you have to have grit, you have to show it, and you have to be consistent, and you have to stick it out to the end, and that requires grit, you know.
Yeah, 100%. Anybody got any other thoughts on that? I got a quick comment here, and then I have a question, but everybody
Just
good
on that, when you start with 1,000 guys and you end up with 10 guys, the great news about that is, if you're one of those 10 guys, not only do you now understand grit, 9 other guys do as well. And so with that tight crew, then you can go on to build a true understanding of what grit means, not only to you, but for a small team. Once that thing gets rocking and rolling, grit becomes really interesting.
That's a good point. I've never really experienced having that many people really understand the same thing in the same way, which would be a fascinating thing to actually be involved in, for sure. Any other thoughts on that before I hit this comment? Good. Okay. So Salty Jinx kicks in with this and he says, I think resilience is learned through applying grit regularly. Grit is learned through discipline and effort to take one more step based on your so what. And your so what being your center of gravity or root cause for why. And I think we kind of covered that, but any other thoughts on it? Anybody?
Yeah,
No?
I mean, a lot of these terms that we're using are, I think, somewhat interchangeable
Yeah.
at some level. The so what is, your desire, your passion, all of those things kind of intermingle, and then going back on the training aspect of it as well. Like discipline and consistency and betterment and like open mindedness and the desire to learn, the desire to grow, all of those things tie into being a better human. And it takes a bit of mental toughness of knowing oneself in order to kind of make that positive decision, in order to stick it out. And sometimes it's challenging, but that's what grit's all about. Is sticking it to the end and achieving your goals, and probably moving your goals a little bit farther away during the process than you had initially thought. You're like, hey, I want to achieve X, but as you're progressing through that training, you're like, hey, I think I might be able to make it to Y, maybe even Z.
X squared.
Take it to the end, and see what you're really, really, really capable of. That optimum performance for you, and it's just growth, man.
Sean, you got a thought on that? You look like you got a thought on
Yeah,
that.
X squared. That's how I like to think of it. What's my X? And then once I'm into the game and I start getting clarity on it and I start understanding that the finish line is within my reach, I want to X square it. I want to make it harder. I want to make it worse. I want to make it more complex. I want to make it more three-dimensional. I want to test myself. How to get gritty? Hard things. But then once you've done hard things, how do you build more grit? To me, I don't think grit is a binary situation where you're either gritty or you're not. I think it is a scale of grittiness, honestly. And I think I'm pretty gritty, but I know people who are grittier than I am, whatever that means. And I know people who are less gritty. So I've been privileged enough to see enough superhuman stuff as a casual observer or as a very specific observer, where I've seen these things, it's just made me realize that maybe I'm a little tough, but I could be tougher based on what I've just seen. And so grit is a scale, I feel, that has no end. I don't think you ever reach 100% grittiness.
No.
Yeah, that's the neat thing about a lot of these topics that we've gone over so far in peak performance is that there really is no peak within a peak performance realm. We lost Larry there for a second, but the question I had for y'all is, can grit ever become a bad thing? Or is it just like the grittier a person, the better? What do you guys think? Larry, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, I definitely think it can become a bad thing if you're not being gritty for what your passion is. If you're out and you're gritty, I mean, there's tough people out there. There's tough people that can make it through. We see it in jiu-jitsu all the time. There's very athletic guys that come into jiu-jitsu and they start doing some competitions and they have some quick success. But if you're not there to learn the art and get better, be a better person, and everything that comes along with being a black belt, you'll never achieve that black belt level. You may be able to go and train with some black belts and occasionally catch black belts, but it doesn't make you a black belt. Same thing in the military. We've all met some really tough, gritty people that can make it through even a selection, but it doesn't mean that you're going to get selected, right? Because it's not your true why. You're doing it either just to prove a point or what have you, or whatever that reason is, but it doesn't stay with you. I think true grit is something that's driven from inside you, whether it's your passion or whatever we want to call that why. But understanding that why is what allows you to apply the proper grit at certain times. I don't think you always have to be gritty either, right? There's some points where you have to, bite down and get through some things and actually apply that grit. Whether it's moving to that next phase and finding something else to challenge you, or getting through the current thing that you're trying to get through. But yeah, I think sometimes grit can become an overbearing attitude that pushes you away from what you're really trying to achieve.
Yeah, I can see that. Jake, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, like, just as you were talking there, Larry, I think that I'm thinking of grit in a very different way, as like it's not like someone's gritty. I was always thinking of grit as like a demonstration in a certain period of time. It's not like, oh, that person is a gritty person. It was this action or this event was they demonstrated grit. And I think there's like the possibility of overexpending, obviously, and you may be digging too deep. And I think that's where we see injuries a lot of times in competition. I think it's if it's driven by passion, that can sometimes skew the logic, and your ego gets involved and is going to possibly negatively impact the overall results. I know most of you guys roll, so jiu-jitsu is like if you go in and you just tire yourself out immediately, but you expended all your energy, passion, and power like that you had, you know, there's a demonstration of grit like being a negative thing. And I do think it has a lot to do with your ego. And like I said, being driven by passion can a lot of times demonstrate a lot of flaws in your skill level. It just might not be there. So
That's a great point. Travis, what do you think?
I agree with that 100%, and I think ego is the enemy of any kind of high performer. Like your ego gets in the way of like doing things smartly. You know, that's when you kind of become emotionally involved and logic checks out, and that's where you have to make the decision. You know, you have to really understand, and you develop the understanding through training of what you're capable of doing. You know, and you have to make the decision also on, is it worth it to you to maybe injure yourself in order to win a tournament, or, you know, do you want to fight again? Is this the last stop? So ego definitely gets in the way. You know, a lot of guys fail to listen because their ego is too loud.
That is a constant struggle for, I think, 99.9% of the population.
Yes.
And before I come to you, Sean, I just want to remind everybody watching, if you have any thoughts or questions, put them up in the comment section here so we can engage them directly. Sean, what do you think? Grit, bad thing? Or too much grit, a bad thing?
Yeah, I think Jake raises a great point, as Larry said. I think that ego is a problem. However, just let me posit this. So as a young man, I had some ego. I've still got ego. I mean, we've all got ego. But it's trying to find the healthy ego in the various phases of our life. And so when I was a young man, I had ego, but ego drove me to the heights that I climbed. And so as I was trying to figure out my young ego that was driving me passionately with perseverance towards, we'll call it the tip of the spear, I was still trying to figure things out, man. I was making a boatload of mistakes. My ego was making me do things that I shouldn't have been doing. Like, they were questionable. But all of those questionable actions, I learned lessons because I failed in those questionable actions. And so ego as a young man, through a process of pushing me through failures and exposing me to my own weaknesses and demonstrating that I can't levitate, all of these things, these were important lessons for me as a young man. So I wouldn't change my ways when I was young. I mean, I said some dumb things. I'm regretful of saying dumb things. I'm regretful of, whatever. But as an overarching theme, my ego drove me in my 20s to get better in my 30s. In my 30s, I started understanding myself a little bit better. Now I turned 60 this year. I understand things way better than when I did when I was 20. But that doesn't mean that I got a grip on my ego. Every single day, I'm trying to observe my ego, trying to shrink my ego or expand my ego, depending on what I need to accomplish in the now or in the very near future. And so I think that ego can be problematic, but I don't want to suggest that if there's any young men or women out there in their 20s looking to get into a adverse career path, or we'll call it mission focused path, like don't think that you've got to like smash your ego down to a non-existent form. You need ego in various phases of your life. Your only job is to make it appropriate ego in the moment if you can.
Yeah, I think maintaining that the healthy desire. We say ego, I think in this context as being a negative thing, and what Sean's getting at is like healthy desire, kind of combined with confidence in your abilities, is maintaining that positive ego, right? Like, I think we've maybe framed it a little bit negatively when I agree that it's not a bad thing if it's healthy desire and confidence in your abilities, and a willingness to learn. That's a big component of a positive ego, is understanding what you know and what you don't. And your desire to better yourself means that you're open to learning.
Yeah. Interesting. Larry, got any points on ego?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a difference though between a positive confidence and an ego. I think sometimes, ego gets in your way. I think ego can be a driving force when you're turning it into a positive confidence. There's nothing wrong with being confident in your ability, even if you don't have the confidence to know what task is available or what you're trying to do, but having the confidence to try and push yourself through, reaching down in, finding your grit. But having that ego of not looking at it with some common sense of what you've got coming forward, is I think what we're all talking about, where you're just haphazardly going, I can get that done. And you just try and push your way through it. Like you said earlier too, in the jiu-jitsu world, that's where the injuries come in. Instead of being confident in your skills and trying something new, and you start throwing things to the wind. And it's the challenging thing with that, especially in jiu-jitsu, is not just that's where you get hurt, that's where you start hurting your training partners. So I agree with you. I think ego pushes you through, but it's a confidence in your abilities and your ability to at least give it a shot and go for it. I think the ego that we're talking about kind of puts everything to the wind, and I'm just going to push my way, I'm going to bite my lip and push my way through it. We definitely have to have that at times to get into those situations and pull ourselves out. But, when you don't take into the considerations of everything to do what has to be done, I think that's where we get caught sometimes.
Jake, you got anything to add on to any of that?
Yeah, I just think obviously there's positive and negatives to ego itself, and I just think that the topic of conversation when it's peak performance, we're talking about people that are already performing at a more than optimal level. So I think that's where I'm thinking of ego in a negative sense. If I went to a beginner and I said, okay, me, right now, we're going to max out on deadlifts. And they're like, well, I've never done a deadlift, but I'll try. And they're going to attempt that no matter what. But the highest they've ever lifted is 120. That's where like your ego gets you in trouble. There's like a confidence in your ability. And then there's this like delusional state that I feel like some people can live in with their ego at times. In consideration of the topic peak performance, I think having too much ego is going to be a bad thing. So
Sean, I can see you smirking down there. So
yeah.
I'm gonna get to you.
He's loving that I'm trying to disagree with him.
It's good. I love it, man.
Yeah.
You raise a good point. I mean, the nuance or the granularity of your comment in respect to a base beginner or a raw beginner versus someone who's been in the game and is close to that, not optimal state, but is heading towards that direction. I think there is a big delineation between those two egos. So you're right to raise it, Jake. However, I think that there is an interesting aspect that we haven't talked about. It's not all on us. Like, our egos, we can shape it any way we want. We can smash it. We can smash it into oblivion, or we can let it flare up to its mega ego state. But whatever we're doing with our ego, we've still always got a plan B to fall back on. And so I'm going to talk about BJJ as the example. And, when I get myself in trouble on the mats, or I'm in a position that I've allowed to happen and now I'm trying to get my way out of it, I don't have to rely on my ego per se. I can fall back on my faith in the system. And so there's a big difference between stepping into a challenging issue as a raw beginner and not understanding how things work. And maybe a few years later, you still don't have a good sense of who you are in the process. But the process has worked for a long, long time for a lot of people that came before you. So when I'm not struggling, but when I have a little bit of doubt as to whether I have the grit, we'll call it, to move through that moment, I can fall back on my plan B and understand that the process that's wrapped all around me, that's created gritty people, that has created amazing people, I know that the process will get me closer to where I need to be. So we were talking about selection when we first kicked off, and you're running towards that finish line, and as you get to the finish line, you think that's the finish line. Yay, I won. Nope, the finish line is now on the horizon. So get to work. Don't even miss a beat. These kind of things, in the moment, you can think, "What? That sucks. There's no way. That's impossible. I can't do that." Or you can refer back to the plan B of, "Hang on a sec. Others have done this. The process worked for them. There is a process. I'll engage in the process, strip my ego out of the way, and let the big team around me that knows what it's doing do its thing, and I'll just fall in step and try to keep up." So, we've got our own little individual journeys, but we're also part of a bigger system. And if you're part of a good, bigger system, then have some faith that can take up some of the heavy lift, as it were.
That's a very interesting point. It kind of goes into this question in that, grit is always looked at as a very singular thing, and we kind of mentioned earlier in the having grit in a team-based system. But I like the idea of using logic and grit to get through something in depth, right?
I think it segues right into like, we're kind of thinking of it like in a one-time event, like in a race or a selection event or something like that. But like, there's also the discipline is a demonstration of grit as well. Like following through with that process that team knows about, that takes time, and being disciplined enough to continue that process, even in the frustration of not yet achieving your end state. Sometimes that process takes a lifetime. There's a lot of people who don't make it because they don't have the intestinal fortitude to continue. And, that's just another word for grit also, is like, I want to be the champion tomorrow. Well, I mean, join the club. Everybody wants that. But do you have the grit to go through the entire training evolution or process to achieve, what you say you desire? Because it's easy to say it, but it's a different thing to follow through.
Yeah, it really is 100%. Jake, you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think what you just said is pretty spot on. I can't argue it, so I almost don't want to talk. No, but I think like when we're talking about peak performance overall, I always come back to is this person delusional at times? Because we can have a gritty, someone who I think of someone who's like a gritty person, like a grinder, that's just trying to do as much as they can as early as they can. And when you're trying to instill information into them as a coach, when you're saying this is factual, and they're like, no, this is not what my brain, I'm going to be Mr. Olympia in 3 years, and they're just starting training. You can have so much grit and it won't matter at a point in time like that. It's that's one of the things that I'm thinking about right now when you're just talking, Travis. That's all I could think about is those couple people that get into that state of delusion and aren't willing to listen because they're so driven to their passion. So I think that there needs to be a switch there to almost turn off grit and be open to listening and kind of turn that passion off for a moment.
Right.
But yeah, other than that.
Yeah, I think that's that difference between, your healthy desire and your willingness to learn, and where your ego comes into play. I don't know how many how many dudes have walked into my gym and walked up to the desk and said, "Yeah, I'm thinking about going to the CrossFit Games next year." And you're like, "Really? Do you have a job?" Well, if you have a job, you're not going. It's like, so there's a little bit, there's an education that has to take place. There's learning involved in kind of whatever you're doing. If it's, a big goal of yours, whatever discipline it is, doesn't matter. There's learning that's involved. And I think that's where that negative ego kind of gets mixed in there, where we got to maybe pump the brakes a little bit and kind of open your ears.
Yeah. Larry, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the whole time that we were talking about the ego, I was picturing in my mind, you're running an open mat, and as a black belt, you're going with one of your blue belts or your purple belts, and you're putting in the time and helping them out. And man, we're all human. So you're going with an ultra heavyweight purple belt, and all of a sudden they've got this black belt smashed, and the black belt has to struggle to regain position. You get into that, and it ends up being a tough round. Well, now that blue belt, that purple belt's ego starts to drive them, and they go grab another black belt for open mat, and they bring it, and they end up getting what they bring, and they just get smashed, right? They get worked. Now all of a sudden that ego's deflated, and you're like, what happened? I was over here with this black belt who's really good, and I know they're good, and I was able to handle them. Well, your ego told you were handling them. They were playing with you at your level, and now all of a sudden you thought, today's my day. I'm going to go put it on these other black belts, and you got what you gave. That's what I was thinking about as far as ego go. It's great. It drives you, but sometimes that ego can cause you to start questioning yourself as well, because you had an unrealistic expectation of something that you were trying to muddle your way through. And some people can take that, and they hopefully, if you're in jiu-jitsu for long enough, you take that and that becomes a learning experience. But we've all, I'm sure, seen people get run out of the gym because of that too. I've seen it from competitions. Guys do great. They're training with people their level, what have you. All of a sudden they go to a competition, their first competition, and they don't perform as great. And next thing you know, they're gone.
Yeah.
So do you guys feel that right there is like the perfect break between grit and resilience? Because the resilient individual is going to take that misfortune and then overcome that misfortune. Whereas that's where I think that it really needs to be something needs to happen, some sort of catalyst for you to become a resilient individual. And I think that's what separates the grit. Like,
That's an interesting
Personally,
thought.
I think that if that's happening in a gym and that purple belt or blue belt gets the smash that they deserve, then that individual now gets to decide not their grittiness. They get to decide how resilient they are going to be in the moment and how resilient they're going to be the following day and probably the rest of the week as their head explodes because they can't understand how they just got smashed so hard or why they're not so mega awesome as they had thought the minute before. And so that moment is the resilient moment where someone gets to decide, okay, I'm going to move through this. But the velocity that they move through that moment is driven by their passion. So if you don't have passion for BJJ, if you just think that you're like the Punisher and you step into the mats for a year and you just go mega, if you don't have the passion for the long game, see you later. I don't even need to know your name because you ain't going to be around that long. I've already forgotten you if you're that kind of guy. But if you show up with authentic passion, I know you're in for the long haul. It doesn't matter to me whether you get smashed or not smashed or you think this or you think that. The mats take care of all of that stuff. What you have to take care of yourself is the passion. Why are you there? Why do you love it? Or why do you hate it? But you got to figure all of these things out in the moment. And if you have the passion, then you can move from resilience into grit. And it's the grit, the combination of passion and the moment. That's what's going to take you forward on the long haul towards grittiness. If you don't have the passion, then all you're developing is resilience.
Travis,
Yeah,
any thoughts on that?
I agree. I think the grit comes from
Oh,
that
sorry.
person has a deflated ego. They come back, they get deflated and beat up again with people at their level. And then they come back again and they get handled by people at their level. And then they sign up for a tournament again anyway. And they're struggling through a match, and it comes down to the last 30 seconds, and they rely on what they've taught in the game that they've been playing. And next thing you know, they pull it out with 30 seconds left. That was the grit moment. That was where they had to dig deep, because it's still something they love to do, and they're just trying to figure it out.
I dig that.
Yeah. I think you might be frozen, but Travis, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think kind of a difference between the person who displays that characteristic, you know, the grittiness, the resilience to stick it out, is somebody that is more concerned with their, you know, with their performance than their image, you know, like earlier when we were talking about ego as a negative, you know, most of those negative egos probably belong to people who are very, very concerned with what other people, or their perception of what other people think of them. And people who are really in it for kind of the end game, for peak performance, really kind of don't care of what you think of me. I'm just here to do the best that I possibly can, you know. And if you ever are lucky enough to work in an environment where nobody cares about like we care about your performance, dude. Like we want you to perform every single day. And if you reach a point where that's not what you want to do, then your bags are in the hallway, bro. You know, like, you know, it's just the difference between one of my favorite phrases. Honestly, I don't even know where I learned it, but somewhere through my military career, you know, the best lessons, they usually hurt a little bit, you know, and that translates right over to that open mat day, you know, where, you know, some guy, maybe a new blue belt, is kind of whooping up on somebody, you know, that's newer and kind of thinking he's hot, you know, and then maybe the black belt kind of glances over there and sees him and decides, you know, maybe this dude needs a lesson. And he kind of puts him in his place and, you know, checks the ego a little bit, gives him a little bit of a lesson that hurts somewhat, but it's a positive thing in the long run, because then you're like, okay, cool. You know, I'm learning, you know, the techniques that I have, they're reinforced when they work. The techniques that I'm working on or things that I need to learn, you know, are identified when those techniques that I have don't work anymore, you know, so it's a learning process, you know, and being open to that is important.
100%. I have a thought that I wanted to postulate here as I've been listening to you guys talk, is that, you know, in order to create grit, like the actual grit, small fine pieces of sand and rocks and things like that, it requires erosion. And erosion is a long period of a slow removal of the outer shell of whatever it is, or it is a breaking up of a larger piece, right? And so I started thinking about that as if your ego as a young man is this large rock that's kind of being tumbled through a river, and as time passes, that is separated more and more and more into finer grains of sand, which eventually end up turning into grit if you allow it to. But I was just I thought it was an interesting concept in my own head of how grit is based on having your ego cut, whether it's a small cut, sometimes it's a big cut, sometimes it's a smash into the rock, sometimes it's a whatever, right? But every time that happens, you gain a little bit of grit if you're paying attention, in my mind. What do you guys think? Sean?
Yeah, I'm totally good with that example, that visual image. And if that's the case, in my 20s, I was a freaking mountain being broken down into a sandy beach, which I'm still trying to achieve, as it were. I'm probably somewhere in the Pebbles region right now. Maybe by the time I'm dead, I'll have reached the grittiness of sand. Who's to say? But I think that is the process. You've got to start with raw material, and it's got to get smashed down into the version of yourself that works best in the phase of your life, in the world that you're in. And so you can take all of the smashing that you want. You can sign up for the smasherific course for the rest of your life. But if it's not doing you any good, then it's the wrong course. It's the wrong program. It's the wrong trajectory for you. And it'll definitely be the wrong trajectory if you don't have the passion for it. Me, I like my career. I like my trajectory. My trajectory took me on the right trajectory for me because it posed the challenges that I needed as a young man, and my life today poses the challenges that I need in this phase of my life. And so if I was sitting on my hands staring at the sky bored, that ain't grit. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say that whatever grit you've got, the moment that you take a hallway pass on life, those gritty particles start reforming themselves into the sand is now a pebble, the pebble is now a mountain, as it were. So I think that grit is not something that you achieve level 8 out of 10 of grittiness and it's there for the rest of your life. If you take a decade off, you're back to a 2 out of 10 in grittiness, in my opinion.
Yeah, I can see that happening for sure. Jake, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just like I kind of said before, like I think there's moments of being gritty. Like I don't think you can maintain it. I don't think that you own it. I think that it's either something you demonstrate at a specific time period that is something you have to overcome. I don't think that they're like you get a badge. Now I'm a gritty person and I'm going to always persevere in the last 30 seconds of the basketball game or football game. I'm always going to be there. You have to earn it every single time that you compete or train or anything. I also think that Sean is definitely still a mountain and is unwilling to accept it. But we could talk about that on another call.
We could set that up for sure. Travis, you got any thoughts?
Yeah, I think you can develop grit though. Like, I mean, we've spoken about it before, and I think Sean will agree with this. Like, we've talked about adventuring, and kind of how do you develop your capacity to persevere. It's by exposing yourself to the unknown, kind of like maybe at a small baby steps. The longest journey starts with one step. So just kind of getting out there and exposing yourself to new challenges and making it through those and learning from that and learning from the example of others. When you see, you take Sean's example, other people have done this. It's not impossible. I'm going to do it too. So learning from others' example and just kind of embracing it. Embracing the challenge. And being open to the learning process is also important.
Yeah, absolutely. Larry, I'm not sure if you heard the question or not earlier, but do you have any thoughts or do you want me to repeat the question for you?
No, yeah, I got you. I think, to Sean's point, I think there's gritty people, no doubt. I think even gritty people at certain points have to go through a grit. There's a different level of grit that they have to dig down into to go through something they're going through. Like I said earlier, we all know tough people that have gone to selection, but for whatever reason, they ring the bell. They wash out because it wasn't their why. It wasn't whatever reason. There's plenty of gritty people doing jiu-jitsu. There's plenty of gritty people that go all the way through and get to black belt and then never train anymore. Right? There's still another level of grit that they need to go through even at black belt, because even at black belt, that's when it begins. So I agree that there's grittiness you have to go through all through it, but I think when you have something that's really a passion for you, there's times where you have to just bite down on the lip and go through some grit. That's certain parts of what you have to go through in your journey.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Sean, you had a thought?
I do. One additional layer of grittiness, as far as I'm concerned, is if you're in the grit, if you're in a gritty moment, let's call it a selection, then the next level to understanding grittiness is being a directing staff on a selection. Because not only are you observing someone in the grittiness of the moment, you're learning about the overarching process that someone is in the grit, as it were. So you have a higher order of intellectual understanding of what it takes to be gritty, and you better understand the outcomes or the fallouts of when someone isn't gritty. And I'm thinking of someone who is a black belt on a BJJ mat. Me, only 8 years in. I have my own perspective of what grittiness is on the mats, but that doesn't mean that I have the higher order of intellectual understanding of a BJJ black belt as an instructor observing the entire mat. I can observe myself. I can observe everyone around me, but that doesn't mean that I understand it from that higher order of intellectual capacity. So I think that the levels to grit are not just our own personal grittiness. They're not just based on the moment in front of us. It's based on our phase of life and how much grit we've experienced. And maybe, if we're lucky, evolve to, I'll call it a higher level of grittiness, where you are in the game of creating grit, or you're in the game of understanding people who are trying to understand grit, as it were.
Yeah, I totally understand that. Now we are just about out at, but just about, excuse me, just about at time. And I know Jake, you have to take off right away. But so let's jump into some final thoughts. Before I do that, though, it kind of clicked in my head is that it's almost like a strainer, like a sifter, right? You can go from, if you've ever seen, gold mining operations where they have this shaker and they take all the big stuff and it shakes down into the smaller stuff, and then that gets sifted down into smaller stuff and smaller stuff and smaller stuff. And as that process happens, that little bit of refinement makes it a little bit, there's fewer pieces that are that small and fewer pieces that are that small. And then you get into a very rare group of people that are very, very fine sand.
Do you mind if I play with that for a sec? I know
Sure.
we're close to the finish, but that's a great analogy or a great visual example. But here's where my head went to with that. When you start off as a young man, me as a young man in my 20s, I was like big freaking river pebbles. And then through a process, it ground me down. I gained my grit. I started filtering through that thing. And then when you know you're in rarefied filtering process is when your tiny particles, that is, it's being shaken out in the water as you're mining for that gold. Now you're that little gold flake that falls into the river and gets washed away by the river. And that's the beautiful part, man. If you get smashed down enough, if you understand grit enough, if you can be a tiny particle of grit in a river, now you're like water, baby. Now it's full Bruce Lee, closing the loop, be like water.
I like it. So let's do some final thoughts then. Jake, I'm going to do your first. So if you need to take off, you can.
Yeah,
What
if
are
I
your
can-
thoughts on grit?
Overall, I think like one of the most important things that everyone will agree on here is that we have to find our passion. We have to find our why first. We have to find our meaning to be resilient and persevere, right? If you don't have a why, if you don't have a good reason to compete and try and apply effort, then you're not going to actually be able to find that grittiness inside of you. So I think finding the why is the most important part of all this conversation, to be able to find the grit itself. So I'll end on that. And then it was really nice showing up today, guys. It was nice meeting you, gentlemen, and I'll see you all very soon.
We'll get you back on here
Cheers,
shortly,
Jake.
whenever you want, buddy.
Okay, guys.
Travis, what are some of your final thoughts?
We talked a lot about the individual capacity to drive on, and grit. And then there's also another level that introduces a team dynamic into it when you are amongst others who have displayed the capacity for what seems to be sometimes superhuman achievement, and then you exist in that. That's a whole another dimension to the grittiness. What teams can do together. A group of gritty individuals is a force to be reckoned with. And if you can master that, as a group, then that's pretty impressive. And you can use each other to learn further, to develop more grit, and then you'll finally become that little flake of gold that Sean was talking about. But I think to become that, you probably need to be surrounded at some point by other people who are virtually there themselves. A bunch of 20-year-old dudes that are the pebbles and the rock stones. They're probably not going to achieve that by themselves. They need mentorship and a coach or something to help them achieve that.
Yeah. And I think they need to bounce off each other a bunch of times first too.
Yeah.
Larry, some final thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. And Sean, I think that's a perfect analogy in talking about whether you're talking about selection, whether you're talking about achieving whatever that highest rank is for you in jiu-jitsu and your competitiveness and that level. It's about being able to be shook down into that finding peace that takes you into being, whether it's a golden or however you look at that. I think it goes back to the bad ego with that. The person with the wrong, I'm not gonna say bad ego. I'm gonna say the person with the wrong ego will never allow themselves to get shaken down into that hole because they already think that they're doing the things that they've got to. And the right person is gonna maybe steer you down a completely different course when they see from their experiences of, to your point, of being able to stand back and look at the room and how to make those changes. So I agree with you. I think, it takes that tribe to be able to get those people to that next level. But it also takes the person. So that can be another way of grit, of knowing, hey, it's not necessarily physically something I've got to bite my lip and get down in. It's my own ego I've got to put in check and listen to how do I get more refined and get better at what it is that I want to be at.
Yeah, 100%. Sean, final thoughts?
Yeah, well, thanks, fellas. You made my life a whole lot easier because you basically said the things that I was thinking, except you said it better. I think I'll just close on this, that at my phase of life right now, I fully understand the importance of surrounding yourself with the right people. And when I was 20, I wish I could have had folks like our guests right now surrounding me as mentors, as leaders, as guiding spirits, as it were, in my young journey. I had guys that did do that for me, but I just didn't understand it then. I didn't understand the process that was wrapped around me and value it as much as I should have. But it's upon reflection now, this phase of my life, that I can look back at that young man and realize I could have done it better. And I understand how I could have done it better now. And I think that that's the key. At 20, I couldn't explain any of this stuff to anyone. But now at my age, I can explain this to people, myself included. These things take time. You've got to refine your sense of wisdom about these overarching subjects called grit. You can't go pour yourself a cup of grit this morning. You've got to earn it over a period of time. And how are you going to develop that timeline? Well, you can do it on a solo journey, bumbling your way through life, or you can go find mentors, leaders, guiding individuals within your trajectory and latch onto them for all the wisdom that you can absorb from them, just as I did in this discussion today. I'm better for it. Hopefully anyone who listens to it will be better for it. And by the end of today, hopefully you can identify someone in your life right now that you haven't reached out to or you haven't used to its full potential. Give them a call, drop them an email, shoot them a text, send them a DM, whatever it takes. Connect with them and say, hey, listen, I'd love to spend a little bit of time with you and hear your thoughts on some things. Go seek wisdom.
Mm-hmm. That's a great way to end it. Go seek wisdom. I like that a lot. Now, the one thing I did want to touch on just for a second was the fact that there are lots of ways to define grit. There are lots of words to utilize grit. And I'm going to use some of them so that everyone gets a good sense of what we're talking about here. And so grit is guts, gumption, perseverance, tenacity, resolution, determination, hardiness, toughness, steel nerves, backbone, metal, courage. You can call it whatever you want. At the end of the day, what you have to do is learn about it. And the best way to learn about it is to build off of what others have done before you. And once you can do that, then you can grow into the person that you are meant to be. And you can do that with us every day here on The Collective. We'll see y'all tomorrow. Chimo.
Jimo.